Why do the strongest people feel the most alone? Why are those destined for greatness the ones who break first? He had everything taken from him. His peace, his people, even his voice. But what if I told you that the loneliness was never a punishment? It was a preparation. This is not just a speech. This is a journey into the heart of a soul that refused to stay broken. And what you will hear might shatter everything you believe about pain, purpose, and power. Stay with me, because by the end, you will never see your suffering the same way again. The room was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that hums in your ears, like it is hiding something, waiting to speak, but choosing not to. He sat alone on the edge of a rusted metal bed. Its frame creaked beneath the weight of his thoughts. The walls around him were cracked, paint peeling like skin after sunburn, revealing the rawness beneath. A single light bulb swung overhead, flickering, buzzing, as if it was struggling to stay alive. Outside, thunder growled in the distance. Raindrops tapped against the window like impatient fingers. He stared at his hands, scarred, tired, calloused from carrying burdens no one else could see. This was not strength. It was survival, and survival had a cost. You see, chosen ones do not walk golden paths. They crawl through fire. They bleed on glass. They learn to smile while choking on silence. People admire their power, but they never ask where it came from. They think the chosen are lucky, blessed, different. But what they do not see, what they never want to see, is the pain that carved them into what they are. They do not see the nights they begged the sky for mercy, the moments they prayed for someone to understand, to stay, to hold on. But no one did, because no one could. To be chosen is to be left behind, to be broken before being built. He remembered the voices, whispers from those who once stood beside him, now gone. They said he changed. They said he was cold, distant. But the truth was, he had to burn his softness to survive the storm. And in that storm, he lost more than just people. He lost himself. Yet still, he stood, not because he was fearless, but because he had already tasted every flavor of fear, and none of them scared him anymore. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him unstoppable. But it also made him lonely, because when you rise from the ashes, not everyone recognizes you. Not everyone wants to. Some fear the fire in your eyes. Others are blinded by it. He looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. His face was tired, but his eyes, they burned, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. Truth. The truth that the world breaks those it cannot control, and builds legends from the ruins. He leaned closer to the mirror. His breath fogged the glass, but his gaze remained sharp. Behind those eyes was a storm, silent, but alive. The kind that tears through a soul when no one is watching. The kind that leaves behind not wreckage, but revelation. The truth was not pretty. It was not clean or inspiring in the way people wanted. It was jagged. It was cruel. It was honest. Being chosen did not feel like a gift. It felt like exile. Like being born into a war you never agreed to fight. Like waking up every day wearing armor made of memory. He remembered the first time it happened. The first time he realized he was not like the others. Everyone else laughed easily, spoke lightly, lived like they belonged. But he felt everything too deeply. Words pierced him. Silence drowned him. And kindness confused him, because it always came with a cost. The world did not like people like him. It liked people who fit in, who obeyed, who followed without question. But chosen ones are not built to follow. They are born to question, to challenge, to break cycles. And that is where the loneliness begins, not in the silence of a room, but in the noise of a crowd, where you cannot find your voice. In the middle of celebration, where your heart feels like stone, because they see your light, but not your shadow. He remembered the mentors, the ones who came and went, each of them looking into his eyes and seeing potential, each of them walking away when that potential grew too loud. They said he was intense, too serious, too sensitive, as if those were flaws. But what they did not understand, what no one ever seemed to understand, was that his sensitivity was not a weakness. It was a radar. It told him who was lying, who was pretending, who was silently screaming behind perfect smiles. And that was the curse. He saw too much. He felt too much. And so he carried too much. He carried the pain of others as if it was his own. And in the process, he forgot how to carry himself. He stopped speaking about what hurt, because when he did, people turned away. Or worse, they tried to fix him. But he did not need fixing. He needed space to feel. He needed someone to say, "I see you." Not, "You will be okay." Because sometimes, being okay is not the point. Sometimes, you just want to be understood. He walked over to the window. The rain had turned violent. The wind screamed against the glass, as if begging to be let in. And he understood that wind, that ache, that relentless search for something solid, something safe. His breath caught in his throat, a lump that had no name, only a weight. He clenched his fists, not in anger, but in exhaustion, because carrying greatness meant carrying grief. They never tell you that. They show you the victories, the spotlight, the applause. But they do not show you the nights you tremble in bed, wondering if your voice still matters, if your fight still has purpose. They do not show you the friends who leave, because they cannot keep up with your growth, the lovers who cannot hold space for your scars, the family who asks you to tone it down, to shrink so they can stay comfortable. He had done that before. Shrunk, dimmed, softened his truth to fit in rooms too small for his fire. But no more, because the fire had grown, and so had he. And if that meant walking alone, so be it. He looked down at his reflection again, no longer just a man, but a storm, a lesson, a legacy in motion. He had learned to love his solitude, not because he chose it, but because it chose him, because it was in that silence that he heard his real voice, and it was in that voice that he found his freedom. Not freedom from pain, but freedom through it, the kind of freedom that does not apologize, that does not beg to be understood, the kind that rises, even when no one claps, the kind that stays, even when everyone else leaves. He took a deep breath. The air was thick with rain and rust, but it was real. It was his. And in that moment, he realized he was not broken. He was being built. He was being built, not into what the world expected, but into what the world needed. Not into something perfect, but into something true. And truth, real truth, is not smooth. It is raw, jagged, like stone carved by centuries of pressure. He walked away from the mirror, each step slow, deliberate, not because he was uncertain, but because he had finally decided to no longer rush his becoming. The air still buzzed with electricity, not from the light bulb, but from something deeper, something sacred, something awakening. Outside, the storm howled louder, the kind of sound that shakes trees at the root, the kind that tests the strength of every window, every door, every soul. He opened the window. Rain splashed against his face, cold, sharp, like 1,000 tiny truths slapping him awake. But he welcomed it. He did not flinch. He stood there, letting the storm baptize him, because that is what chosen ones do. They let the world break over them, again and again, until only the core remains. And it is that core, that indestructible core, that becomes their power. People often ask, why are the chosen ones always so distant, so intense, so broken? But they never ask, what broke them, or who left them there. They never ask how many nights they screamed into pillows, just to keep the pain private, how many times they buried dreams, because no one believed in them, how many times they stayed silent, so others would feel safe. But silence was never safety. It was suffocation. And now, he was done suffocating. He walked through the room, his fingertips trailing along the walls, touching the history etched into every crack. He remembered the conversations that never healed, the promises that dissolved into echoes, the people who said they cared, until caring became inconvenient. He had mourned them, all of them. But grief was not his enemy. Grief became his sculptor, because every heartbreak carved him deeper. Every betrayal sharpened his vision. Every failure chiseled away what was false, until only what was necessary remained. And that necessity, that divine, painful necessity, was his calling. Chosen ones are not picked at random. They are not lucky. They are refined, forged in fire, pressed by pressure, tempered by loneliness. They are not the loudest in the room. They are the ones listening when everyone else talks. They are not always the leaders you expect, but they are always the ones who walk alone when no one else dares, because they do not follow maps. They become them. He sat down on the floor, back against the wall, rain still whispering secrets through the open window. And for the first time in years, he did not feel like a mistake. He did not feel like a burden. He did not feel like he had to be fixed. He felt sacred, like everything he endured was a rite of passage, not a punishment, but a preparation. He thought of the younger version of himself, the boy who trembled before speaking his truth, who dimmed his ideas, so others would not feel threatened. He wished he could reach into the past and hold that boy's face. Tell him, you are not too much. You are just early. Early to feel, early to break, early to awaken. But awakening always comes with loneliness, because when you see what others ignore, you cannot unsee it, and that vision becomes your responsibility. Not everyone will understand. Not everyone will stay. And that is the cost. But it is also the proof. He closed his eyes. The room faded into sensation, the cool air on his skin, the hum of the storm, the steady beat of his own heart. He was still here, still breathing, still rising. And that, despite everything, was a revolution. Not the kind you see in movies, but the quiet kind, the kind that happens deep within the soul. When a broken man finally stops apologizing for his strength, he opened his eyes, and they burned brighter than before, not with rage, not with sorrow, but with clarity, because he finally understood. The loneliness of the chosen one is not a curse. It is an invitation to go deeper, to walk farther, to carry light where others only bring shadows. And when you do that, when you truly become that light, you stop searching for a place to belong, because you realize you were never meant to belong. You were meant to lead, to awaken, to become. He stood up slowly, each movement no longer burdened by self-doubt, but guided by something ancient, something unshakable. The walls around him were still cracked, still old, still stained by a past that had tried to break him. But now they felt different. Now they felt like a museum of the storms he had survived. He touched one of the cracks, felt the rough edge beneath his fingertips. It reminded him of his own edges, the jagged pieces he had tried to smooth out for others. But those rough parts, they were sacred too. They told the story of endurance, of battles fought in silence, of the nights when all he had was his breath and the echo of his own voice. He walked to the door, that old wooden frame that had always seemed too heavy to push open, and yet today it swung with ease, not because it was lighter, but because he was stronger. The hallway beyond was dim, lit only by the distant flicker of a broken exit sign, the kind of place that used to make him hesitate. But this time, he did not. He stepped into the darkness without fear, because he had walked through darker places, inside himself. And now, every step forward was a rebellion, a statement, a refusal to shrink. He remembered the people who once told him to stay humble, when what they really meant was, stay small. He remembered how they praised his light, only when it warmed them, but cursed it when it started to shine on their shadows. He had tried to love them anyway, had tried to prove he was worthy, had tried to belong in places where his voice was too loud, his truth too inconvenient. But the truth does not care about convenience. It only cares about liberation. And so he walked on, liberated from needing to be liked, freed from the lie that love means staying silent. His footsteps echoed in the hallway, each one louder than the last, like a drumbeat, calling him home. Not home in the physical sense, but home to himself. He passed rooms that once held memories, conversations that ended in confusion, relationships that collapsed under the weight of his growth. He did not hate them. He did not curse them. He simply honored them as chapters, not destinations. He reached the end of the hallway. A set of steel doors stood before him, cold, closed, unwelcoming. But he had faced colder hearts, and he had opened tighter doors. So he placed his hand on the steel, and it felt like touching every moment he was told no. Every time he was denied, dismissed, doubted, but still, he pushed. The metal groaned, hinges protesting like old ghosts. But the door gave way, and on the other side, light, blinding, pure, unforgiving in its brilliance. He stepped into it, eyes stinging, heart racing, because that is what stepping into your destiny feels like. Terrifying and true. There were no crowds, no applause, no cheering voices, just him, and the light, and the sound of his own breath. Finally steady. He looked down. The floor beneath him was cracked too, but it held him, and that was enough. Because chosen ones do not need perfect ground. They only need to trust the steps. And he trusted now. He trusted that the pain had purpose, that the silence had been sacred, that the loneliness had forged leadership, that the breaking was never about destruction. It was about transformation. He looked up into the vast sky above. It was no longer gray, no longer suffocating. It was open, endless, inviting. And he knew, somewhere deep inside, that this was only the beginning. Because chosen ones are not defined by where they come from, but by where they are willing to go. Alone if they must. Fearless because they must. Unapologetic because they have learned that becoming yourself fully is the most radical act of all. He took one more step forward, into the light, into the unknown, into everything he was always meant to be. And though the world might still call him broken, he knew better now. He was built, and still being built, brick by brick, scar by scar, step by step, and nothing, not pain, not loss, not solitude, could ever take that away from him again. The wind shifted as he moved forward, no longer howling, but whispering, a language he could now understand. It spoke of resilience, of memory turned into muscle, of nights that did not kill him, but stripped him down to what truly mattered. Each breath he took was a declaration, not just that he was alive, but that he had chosen to stay alive, that he had chosen to keep walking, even when his legs trembled, even when the road disappeared. The path ahead was not paved with certainty. It twisted, it cracked, it vanished into fog. But for the first time, he did not need to see the whole journey. He only needed to trust the next step. There were voices in his head, old ones, cruel ones, voices that once lived rent-free in his silence. They said he was too broken, too emotional, too much. But now, he heard them differently. He saw them not as truth, but as echoes of frightened people who had never dared to feel fully. And he forgave them, not because they deserved it, but because he did. He forgave the ones who left when he began to shine too brightly, the ones who mocked his tears, who laughed at his dreams, who called his depth a weakness. He forgave the world for not making room for people like him, because now he understood. He was never meant to fit in. He was meant to build the room, a room for the misfits, for the soft-spoken warriors, for the dreamers who feel too much, and the leaders who are born from silence. He had always thought love was something you had to earn, that you had to bend, shrink, compromise. But love, real love, begins the moment you stop begging for it, the moment you give it to yourself first. So he did. He loved himself in that raw, unfiltered way that terrifies the world, the kind of love that does not look away from a mess, that sees the flaws and calls them features. He loved the ache in his chest because it meant he was still open, still willing to feel, still willing to care, even after all the damage. He loved the stretch marks on his soul, proof of how far he had come, of how much he had grown. Even when no one was watching, he had learned to stop chasing validation, to stop molding himself into what others wanted, because every time he did that, he bled, and there was no glory in bleeding for people who would never notice the stains. So now, he wore his truth like armor, not to defend himself, but to honor himself, because hiding had cost him too much, and silence had become too loud. He thought of all the others, the quiet warriors like him, sitting alone in rooms filled with self-doubt, wrestling with demons that wear familiar faces. He wanted to speak to them, to tell them that their loneliness was not a punishment, but a path, that the broken pieces they hated were actually blueprints, maps to a version of themselves they had not met yet, that their intensity was not a flaw. It was a compass, and it always pointed toward something real. He thought of the world, so obsessed with perfection, with polished smiles and curated lives. But the real beauty? It lived in the unedited moments, in the breakdowns behind closed doors, in the way someone keeps going, even after everything tells them not to. That was power, and he had it now. He walked farther into the light, not rushing, not looking back. His past would not disappear. It would walk with him, but no longer as a weight. Now it was wisdom. Every scar on his heart was a sentence in his story, and he would never again let someone else hold the pen. The light warmed his skin. It wrapped around him like recognition, like a long-lost friend, welcoming him home. And he smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because he finally knew. He did not need perfection to be powerful. He was enough. Flawed, wounded, radiant, and enough. And if the world could not understand him, if people still chose distance, still feared his fire, that was no longer his concern. He was not here to be liked. He was here to be real, to tell the truth, to break patterns, to carve light into every room he entered. Because that is what chosen ones do. They shine, even when no one asks them to, even when it hurts, even when they are alone. And in that unwavering, untamed radiance, they become a lighthouse for others, still lost at sea. He stood tall now, not because he had won, but because he had endured. And that, in the end, is what truly makes someone chosen. His shadow stretched behind him as he stood in the light, not as a burden, but as a testament. It moved with him, proof that even darkness follows those who carry fire. His footsteps no longer echoed in fear, but in certainty. He had become the kind of man who no longer needed the world's permission to exist fully. He did not shrink himself to be palatable. He did not silence himself to be safe, because the world had taken so much from him already. His innocence, his softness, his quiet dreams. But what it could not take was his will, his soul's refusal to die in a cage. He had walked through the furnace of abandonment, through the blizzards of betrayal. He had eaten alone, slept with pain, breathed through the smoke of burning bridges. And all of it, every jagged moment, every heartbreak that felt like 1,000 knives, had shaped him, not into a victim, but into a vessel for truth, for courage, for depth in a world starving for realness. He no longer looked at his scars with shame. They were sacred now, proof that he had faced what others fled. He had outgrown every version of himself that once begged to be accepted. The boy who hid his tears, the teen who masked his pain with jokes, the man who swallowed his words so he would not sound too deep. All of them, still inside him, but no longer in control. He led them now. He whispered to those inner versions, "I see you. I forgive you. You did what you had to, so I could become who I was born to be." This was not just growth. It was resurrection. He was not rising from failure. He was rising from silence, from years of pretending, of minimizing, of surviving without thriving. He remembered standing in rooms filled with people, smiling, nodding, and dying inside, not because he was broken, but because he had no space to be whole. People had loved the mask. They had applauded the performance, but no one clapped for the parts he kept hidden, the nights he shattered quietly, the mornings he rebuilt alone. Now, he clapped for himself, for every time he held back tears in public and let them fall in the dark, for every dream he whispered when the world told him to be realistic, for every time he stood up again when it would have been easier to disappear. He clapped, not for the man they saw, but for the man he knew, because that man had earned his existence, not through charm or convenience, but through grit, through grief, through growth. He kept walking. There was no final destination, no finish line to this kind of becoming. It was a lifelong unfolding, a shedding of all that was false, a returning to what had always been true. And that truth was this: the chosen ones are lonely, because they are led by something invisible, something the world cannot explain, something the shallow cannot follow. They are broken, not by accident, but by design, so they can feel, so they can see, so they can speak the kind of language that only pain can teach. They are not here for comfort. They are here for clarity, and clarity does not come from smooth roads and easy praise. It comes from losing everything you thought you needed and finding out you were enough all along. The world wants them to doubt it, to go numb, to forget. But he would not forget. He would remember every night he thought of giving up, and he would use those memories as fuel. He would remember the silence and become a voice. He would remember the emptiness and become a home, not just for himself, but for others who felt the same. Because he knew now, his story was not a tragedy. It was a manual, a survival guide, for anyone who had ever wondered if the pain would ever end, if the loneliness had meaning, if the breaking had purpose. He was proof that you can be shattered and still rise, that you can be abandoned and still choose love, that you can walk alone and still lead multitudes. Because leadership is not about popularity. It is about presence, about standing still in the middle of chaos and becoming the eye of the storm. He had become that, still, grounded, unmoved, not because the pain stopped, but because he learned how to carry it differently, with grace, with truth, with sacred defiance. And now, wherever he went, he would carry light, not the blinding, artificial kind, but the quiet flame that says, "You are not alone. You are not wrong. You are just early." And if no one else understood, he would still walk. He would still shine. He would still rise, because he had finally remembered who he was. Before the world tried to forget him, the sky above him opened wider now. No longer a ceiling, but a canvas. It stretched into forever, inviting him not just to dream, but to live the dream without apology. He walked without rushing, his body aligned with something greater, something timeless. The wind no longer pushed against him. It danced with him, not as an obstacle, but as an ally. This was not a new version of himself. This was the original version, the one buried beneath layers of shame, expectations, and wounds that were never his to carry. He had peeled those layers away, like dead skin, each one falling to the ground, with the sound of old beliefs breaking. He was not the problem. He was the answer to generations of silence. He was the echo of his ancestors' unspoken prayers. People had tried to define him, put him in boxes with labels too small for his soul. But no label ever captured the storm inside. No category held the truth of what he carried. So he stopped trying to fit and started learning how to flow. He flowed with grace through the memory of abandonment, through the heaviness of misunderstood love, through the shadow of betrayal that had once followed his every step. He flowed into a version of existence that needed no performance, no perfection, just presence, just truth, just the courage to be seen as he truly was. And now that he had found it, the courage, the clarity, the voice, he knew he would never go back. Not to the lies, not to the shrinking, not to the pretending. He would never again trade authenticity for acceptance, because he had tasted the power of being whole, even if it meant being alone. And that was the paradox. The chosen ones feel most lonely when they betray themselves to belong, and most alive when they finally stop explaining their worth. He exhaled slowly. His chest rose with purpose. Each breath no longer felt like survival. It felt like creation, because he was building something now. Not a career, not a reputation, but a legacy, a way of living so honest that it would leave footprints of permission for others to follow. He would become a mirror, reflecting truth to those who forgot what it looked like. He would become a shelter for those still carrying rain clouds in their chest. And he would do it, not because he wanted to be a savior, but because he remembered what it felt like to need one and find none. So he would become what he never received. That was the sacred work. He smiled now, a small, knowing smile, the kind that comes not from happiness, but from alignment. He no longer feared rejection, because he no longer feared himself. He no longer needed applause, because he could hear the rhythm of his own soul, clapping just fine. He no longer chased peace, because he had learned to carry it. He had built a sanctuary inside his own ribcage, a place where truth lived, and love flowed without conditions. And from that place, he would speak, he would write, he would lead, not to impress, but to ignite, because the world was waiting for something real, for someone real. And now that he had found his fire, he would light the way, even if no one came, even if no one clapped, even if he had to walk alone. He had made peace with solitude, not as an exile, but as a sanctuary. And in that quiet place, he had discovered the secret. The chosen ones are lonely, not because they are unlovable, but because they are uncompromising. They refuse to dim their truth, to make others comfortable. They refuse to betray their soul, to follow the crowd. And in that refusal, they become rare. They become sacred. They become the spark that reminds the world what it means to feel deeply, to live honestly, to rise endlessly. So he walked, not toward a destination, but toward a life that would never again require him to pretend. And in that walk, each step was a revolution, each breath a reclamation. He was no longer just surviving, he was becoming. And he knew now, beyond all doubt, that nothing was ever wrong with him. He was just the kind of soul that takes time to understand, and he was worth the wait. And now, as he stood at the edge of everything he once feared, he did not tremble. He breathed. He smiled. He remembered. Every wound had become a window, every scar a story, every lonely night a lesson written in stars. He no longer asked why he was chosen. He knew, because the ones who feel the deepest, who break the hardest, who rise the slowest, are the ones who carry the light that lasts the longest. He was never too much. He was never broken. He was simply becoming who he was always meant to be. So if you feel alone, if you feel lost, if you feel like the world does not understand you, it is not because you are unworthy. It is because you, too, are becoming. And becoming is rarely loud, rarely easy, but always holy. So keep walking, keep feeling, keep rising. The world may not always see you, but the fire inside you was never meant to wait for their permission. You were not made to fit in. You were made to lead, to heal, to shine, even if no one claps, even if no one follows, even if the path is quiet. Walk it anyway, because in your quiet courage, you remind the world that the most powerful souls are often born in silence and rise alone.